We're looking at the media now and what role it has within politics, and we're going to start looking at its role in holding the government to account. So if we go back to 2008, 2009, there was something called the MPs expenses scandal. And basically what happened was MPs are allowed to claim expenses. They have to live in their constituency, so the area they represent, but they also have to go to London and spend a few days a week in London to go to the Houses of Parliament. Because of that, they are allowed to claim rent and stuff for a second house and different bits and bobs for that. However, the Daily Telegraph revealed what they were claiming money for, and some of the things they were claiming money for were just for mortgages that didn't exist, or for hiring videos and all those kind of things. So it was for gardening and excessive amounts of food, paying for relatives to be employed for them who weren't actually working for them, and so on. Some of the MPs were doing things illegally, like claiming for mortgages that didn't exist and for workers that weren't working for them. Because of that, some of them actually got in trouble with the law. Some of them even went to jail. So it actually was a massive revelation that MPs were stealing our tax-paying money. So they were stealing from the public purse. And it was the Daily Telegraph, the media, that announced it to the public. So you can imagine what the reaction of it was by the public. They really were not very happy. So how the MPs were held to account, they were named and shamed, some of them were arrested, lots of people wanting much more serious punishment. The next thing we can look at is the coronavirus crisis of 2020. Piers Morgan on Good Morning Britain interviewed several government ministers about coronavirus and the response that the government had had. So, for example, you may have seen the bit where Boris Johnson back in March was bragging about the fact he'd shaken hands with people in hospital who got coronavirus, the fact that schools weren't shut as early as possibly they should have been, that Cheltenham was allowed to go ahead, that big public gatherings were allowed to go ahead, and that lockdown came far too late for a lot of people. Piers Morgan interviewed the people, the government ministers, and he was quite harsh in his interview style, quite combative, and they got thousands of complaints. They wanted him sacked. Piers Morgan turned around and said, I'm not going to stop. It's going to make me question them more. This is the media's job. The media's job is to hold those in power to account. We all know Dominic Cummings is an aide to Boris Johnson. He's not elected, he's not an MP, but he works very closely with the government. He was one of the people who was instrumental in the lockdown procedures. He actually got caught breaking lockdown rules, visiting his parents who were quite elderly, which was completely against the rules, visiting a castle, saying that he was only doing it to test his eyesight and all sorts. And then Emily Maitlis, who's a BBC presenter, really took him to task on the BBC News. She was quite harsh in her condemnation of him and said it was, a shame that the government had protected him because there were massive calls for him to get sacked. The government did not sack him. The problem is TV is not allowed to be biased. Newspapers can be biased, TV can't, and TV was being biased here. It's also on the BBC. The BBC is paid for by us, the public. It's publicly owned. We pay a TV licence. They don't have adverts. So the BBC is meant to be completely and totally politically neutral. And with this, it really wasn't. Emily Maitlis had to have a few days off. There was a huge call for her to get sacked. And it turned into quite a commotion over her rather than what Dominic Cummings had done. So why is it then that free press is important? Why is it good that our media are allowed to hold the government to account? Well, what happens if you can't? You all know who that man is. We all know what would happen if their journalists were to say something bad about him. Think about what you learnt in Year 9 in history about Nazi Germany and the way that journalists would have been treated there if they'd condemned Adolf Hitler. It's part of a democracy. A huge part of a democracy is having a freedom of press and them not being controlled by the government. So, question says for 8 marks, the press should be able to publish whatever they want about politicians. How far you agree with this? I've got the answers already there for you. Just have a practice at writing an 8-mark question. Remember, you need arguments for, you need arguments against, and they can't just be waffle. There's got to be evidence in there, it's got to be explained, and you've got to have a conclusion. So I've argued, they should be able to prove whatever they want. It's a fundamental part of democracy, a huge part of our democracy. We've got a free press in this country, and that's the way it should be. MPs represent the public, they represent us. If they're representing our views and interests, we should know what that person's like. So even if it's something about their personal life, like maybe they've claimed expenses they shouldn't have done, or maybe they have had an affair, we should know who that person is that's representing our democratic interests. You could argue against. You could say, well, actually, newspapers can be really biased. For example, if they are a right-wing supporting newspaper, they might print something quite unfairly and in a detrimental way about a left-wing politician. You might remember how Jeremy Corbyn was shown to be an IRA sympathiser before the 2019 elections by right-wing newspapers. And that's the problem, news can be fake. Also, and importantly, it's our human right to have a personal and family life. Why should that be splashed all over the newspapers? And then your conclusion is how far you agree. Okay, we've done this question before, but just to remind you, in this country, we don't have censorship like what China does. We don't jail dissident journalists. We have freedom of speech. The role of our media is to hold those in power to account. It's a huge part of our democracy. So how the media influences politics. If we look at these front covers of newspapers, you can see they are really politically motivated. So obviously these two newspapers are encouraging their readers to vote Leave in the Brexit referendum. We've then got some quite anti-Labour headlines here as well. And you can tell by their use of funny language and imagery, they're really trying to get their readers on board. This one here is another thing. You might remember the prorogation of Parliament that was taken to court in 2019 when Boris Johnson prorogued or paused Parliament, and that Gina Miller took the government to the Supreme Court, the top court in the country, most powerful court in the country. There are 13 judges, the top judges in the country, who preside at the Supreme Court, and the leader of the Supreme Court is a lady called Lady Hale. Now, Lady Hale graduated top of her class with a first-class honours degree in law from Cambridge. Very, very clever. Professor of law at Manchester. First woman to be appointed to the Law Commission. Only the second woman to be appointed to the Court of the Appeal. And she's the president of the Supreme Court. She is sort of like, can be seen as a god among women. A really highly appreciated and educated woman. The Daily Mail, who are very pro-Conservatives and Boris Johnson, so didn't like the fact that the Supreme Court had gone against the Conservatives, labelled her an ex-barmaid with a Sprider brooch. So you can see they're not quite on her side and they are using their language to disrespect her. Okay, so this is viewers' ideas of how left-wing or right-wing newspapers are. You can see in the red is left-wing, the blue is right-wing. So things like The Guardian are seen as very left-wing, going down to the Daily Mail as very, very right-wing. The Sun newspaper also is very right-wing if you look as well. The Sun's the biggest selling newspaper in the country, so that's an important one to know. Another important one is The Independent, which clearly is supposed to be independent and not politically biased, but very clearly is. So, some more newspapers as well. That one very clearly saying vote Labour. This one was around the 2010 elections, and there's David Cameron, and it's saying he's not quite one of us, noting some of his background. Okay, This guy's called Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch is a media mogul, huge owner of media outlets. He owns almost all the media in Australia. He owns Fox News, a huge part of Sky TV, the Sun newspaper. He did own the News of the World. He owns HarperCollins Publishing and lots more. The issue is if one person owns all that media, their political views are going to seep through into all of it. So, what does influence who we vote for? You could argue it's the media, you could argue it's newspapers. So if we read The Sun or the Daily Mail and they're telling us to leave the EU or they're telling us to vote for the Tories, that we're going to go out and do it. But are we really that easy to manipulate? Could it be we only read the newspapers that suit our political views anyway, so it's more backing it up rather than influencing it? Who knows? Could be either. TV isn't even supposed to be biased, so how can TV influence us? Although they do have their party political broadcasts. But you can get influenced by other things, your family, for example. If you've got a left-wing supporting family, you're more likely to be grown up that way, and the same with right-wing. Could also be about your protest groups or pressure groups you're involved with. If you followed the EDL or Britain First, then you might have been more likely to vote for UKIP. However, after UKIP's dissolution, you might have gone for Conservatives. Tommy Robinson, who used to be the leader of the EDL, came out over the 2019 elections and publicly announced his support for Boris Johnson, so that could have influenced you that way. Similarly, if you're interested in the environment, you might vote for Greenpeace. And if you're a keen trade unionist, if workers' rights are your thing to be concerned about, then you're probably going to go for Labour. So the next question, an 8 marker. The support of the media is vital to any successful political party's campaign, considering a range of views. To what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement? And you've got to look at the role of the media and the major political parties contesting in the UK general elections. So, their role then, to inform, to educate, to entertain. Political parties, we know that TV is supposed to be unbiased, newspapers are biased. The support of the Sun. The Sun is the most popular newspaper in this country. Whatever political party they follow, that political party always wins. So that is a massive piece of evidence to suggest that yes, the support of the media is vital. But you could also argue, well, the other way, what about your protest groups? What about your unions? And then you'll need a conclusion. And there's some bits you could write about there. Good luck.